All right, let's dive into Simon Sinek's Leaders Eat Last. This book really gets you thinking about leadership, and how putting people first, well, it can actually be the key to a really successful organization.
Yeah, what really struck me? Sinek's blend of stories and science. It's not just like some dry textbook. You actually get hooked.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Like that opening story about Johnny Bravo, that A-10 pilot in Afghanistan. Talk about going above and beyond for your people. Really sets the tone for the whole book, right?
Oh, absolutely. Bravo's actions, they perfectly illustrate that protective instinct Sinek keeps talking about, the foundation of true leadership.
It makes you think about the leaders in your own life, huh? Like, have you ever had a boss or even a coach or someone who really made you feel safe to take risks, to really be yourself?
It's a game changer when you have that, right? That feeling of trust and security. Sinek calls it the circle of safety. And when that circle is strong, people collaborate more, they're more innovative, they just go the extra mile, because they know they've got each other's backs.
It reminds me of that example Sinek gives about Barry Wimler. It was during a rough economic time, and instead of layoffs, the CEO did a company-wide furlough program.
Right. He basically said, hey, we're all in this together. Let's share the burden. No one gets left behind.
So powerful. It really challenges that whole every man for himself idea we see so often in business.
Yeah, and the results were amazing. Instead of freaking out, the employees came together. They started trading shifts, helping each other out. Proves that when people feel valued, they step up.
Sinek actually contrasts this with guys like Jack Welch over at GE, and then Jim Sinegal at Costco. Welch was all about shareholder value, even if it meant, well, kind of stepping on employees to get there.
Yeah, Neutron Jack, they called him.
Sinegal, on the other hand, he built Costco on treating employees fairly. Good wages, solid benefits, real respect for the workforce.
And you know what? Costco has been incredibly successful. Shows that putting people first, well, it pays off in the long run.
So we've got this idea of the circle of safety. But then Sinek takes it deeper, right? He starts talking about the actual biology behind it, like how our brains are wired for cooperation.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. He breaks it down to these 4 chemicals: endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. And each one plays a role in how we behave, what motivates us.
Okay, now this is where I geek out a little. So break it down for me, like, how do these chemicals actually play out at work?
All right, well, first up, endorphins. They're our natural painkillers.
Yeah.
That runner's high you get after a tough workout. Or how about that feeling when you pull an all-nighter with your team and finally nail a project?
Yeah, like you're on top of the world.
Yeah.
So that's endorphins.
Exactly. They help us push through challenges, and there's this shared sense of accomplishment afterwards. It's that shared struggle Sinek talks about. It really bonds people together.
So that's why those tough times, sometimes they actually bring people closer, huh? Makes sense.
Right. Now, dopamine, that's all about reward and motivation. It pushes us towards goals, and when we achieve them, bam! That feeling of satisfaction, that's dopamine. But here's the thing. Dopamine can be, well, kind of addictive.
Okay, so how does that play out in the workplace?
Well, imagine a company that's super focused on hitting targets, chasing bonuses.
Yeah.
People can get so fixated on that next dopamine hit that they lose sight of the bigger picture.
Like they're just chasing that quick fix instead of focusing on what really matters in the long run. And speaking of digging deeper, you can find a link to the full book in the description or pin a comment if you want to learn more.
Right, and that can lead to problems. Sinek uses Goldman Sachs as an example. That intense pressure to perform, it actually led to some pretty unethical behavior, even illegal stuff.
It's like a cautionary tale, right? Dopamine's a powerful motivator, but too much of a good thing, well, it can backfire. We've got to find that balance.
Exactly. Now, switching gears a bit, let's talk about serotonin. This one's all about pride and status, that feeling of, hey, I contributed to the group, I made a difference.
So, like, how can leaders use that, the whole serotonin thing, in a positive way?
By creating a culture of recognition, of appreciation, genuinely acknowledging people's efforts, celebrating their achievements, making people feel valued, that's key.
So it's not just empty praise, it's got to be real, right?
You got it. It's about seeing the value in what people do, making them feel like they're a part of something important, something bigger than themselves.
Okay, so we've got endorphins, dopamine, serotonin. What about oxytocin? I always think of that as the love hormone. What's its role at work?
Oxytocin, that's all about trust and connection. It's what fuels collaboration, empathy, that feeling of belonging to a group, those moments of genuine human connection at work.
Like when a coworker says a heartfelt thank you, or when a team celebrates a win together. Even just the simple act of kindness, those little things.
Yeah, those are all moments that trigger oxytocin, and it strengthens the bonds between people. But here's the thing. Our digital world, it's changing things. We're constantly connected to devices, but are we really connecting with each other?
That's a great point. It's like we're always on, but are we really present? Are we really building those deep connections?
And that's a concern Sinek brings up. He says all this abstraction, interacting more with numbers and screens than actual people, it's actually eroding our ability to empathize, to build trust.
It reminds me of that Milgram experiment Sinek talks about. The one where people were told to give electric shocks to another person.
Oh, yeah. That was a disturbing one.
Can you remind us how that experiment went down?
So back in the 60s, this guy, Stanley Milgram, he wanted to study obedience to authority. Participants were told to shock this other person whenever they got a question wrong. But here's the twist. The person getting shocked was actually an actor, just pretending.
Oh, wow, that's intense. So they weren't actually hurting anyone?
Nope, the shocks were fake. But the participants, they thought they were real. The experiment was all about seeing how far people would go when someone in authority told them to do something, even if it meant inflicting pain.
Wow, so what happened? Did people refuse to do it?
Well, the results were pretty shocking. Most of the participants, they kept giving those shocks, even when the actor was screaming in pain, all because a guy in a lab coat told them to.
That's messed up. But what does this have to do with the workplace?
The point is that abstraction makes it easier to detach from the human consequences of our actions. You get too focused on numbers, targets, metrics. You lose sight of the real people who are affected by your decisions.
Yeah, like when companies put profits above everything else, they might make choices that hurt employees or customers without really grasping the impact.
Exactly. It's a reminder that leadership, it's not just about hitting targets. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe, valued, connected. And that brings us right back to that circle of safety idea.
So how do we build that circle in a world that's becoming more and more abstract, more disconnected? How do we lead in a way that puts people first, not just numbers?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something we'll definitely keep exploring. But first, let's dive into some practical steps that leaders can take to create a more human-centered workplace. Sinek talks about a lot of great examples, but one that really stands out is Captain David Marquet, the submarine captain.
Oh, yeah, the guy who turned around the Santa Fe, right?
Yeah.
It had the worst performance record in the fleet, and he turned it into a top performer.
Yep, that's him. Marquet realized that the traditional command and control style just wasn't working. So he did something radical. He empowered his crew to think for themselves, to take ownership.
Instead of just barking orders, he encouraged his crew to make decisions and then report back with their intentions, right?
Exactly. He shifted from leader-follower to leader-leader. And the results were incredible. The Santa Fe went from worst to first, all because he trusted his people.
It's a great example of how giving people autonomy and trust can lead to amazing results. And it's not just a military thing. Sinek talks about 3M, the company that invented Post-it notes.
Oh, yeah. Those little sticky notes. What about them?
Well, it turns out that Post-it notes came from a failed adhesive product. But 3M had this culture where people felt comfortable sharing ideas, building on each other's work. If they'd been operating from a place of fear, or cutthroat competition, that failed adhesive would have been tossed out, and we'd be living in a post-it-less world.
That's so true. It shows how a circle of safety can actually drive innovation.
Wow.
People need to feel safe, to experiment, to mess up, and to learn from those mistakes.
So what are some key takeaways here for leaders who want to build this kind of culture? What can they actually do?
Sinek really emphasizes leading with integrity, being transparent, and truly committing to the well-being of your people. It's not just talk, it's about action.
Walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly, like Bob Chapman, the CEO of Barry Wehmiller. He's a great example. Remember, instead of layoffs, he did that company-wide furlough program.
Oh yeah, he said something like, it's better we all take a small hit than anyone takes a really big one.
Yeah, that's a leader who understands the circle of safety. He knew that putting his people first would build loyalty, engagement, and lead to success in the long run.
And it's not just about being nice. It's about creating a workplace where people feel safe, valued, connected. And that leads to better performance, more innovation.
Exactly. Sinek shows how this applies to businesses, schools, even the military. We're social creatures. We crave connection. And when leaders tap into that, amazing things can happen.
We're hardwired for it.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Leaders Eat Last, what are some things our listeners can take away?
Well, first off, remember, we're all social creatures. We need connection. Find environments where you feel safe, valued, supported. And if you're a leader, think about how you can create that kind of space for your people. Put them first, the results will come.
It's not about being perfect. It's about building that circle of safety, where everyone feels like they can contribute, grow, thrive. And if you want more, you can find a link to the full book in the description or pinned comment.
A great resource.
But for now, we'll leave you with this thought. How can you create more circles of safety in your own life, at work, in your relationships? Remember, it all starts with putting people first. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here for part 2.
All right, so we were talking about how abstraction can erode empathy and trust in the workplace. It's like we get so caught up in the numbers and the systems that we forget about the actual humans involved.
Right, and it can lead to some pretty messed up situations. Sinek uses a really powerful example to illustrate this point. He talks about the Milgram experiment.
Oh, yeah. The one with the electric shocks. That one always sends chills down my spine.
It's a classic study in psychology, but it has some really profound implications for how we understand leadership and responsibility. So for those who aren't familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of the Milgram experiment?
Sure. So basically, back in the 1960s, this psychologist named Stanley Milgram wanted to study obedience to authority. He designed this experiment where participants were told they were taking part in a study about learning and memory.
Okay, sounds innocent enough. So what did they have to do?
Well, they were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person every time that person got a question wrong.
Wait, seriously? Electric shocks? It sounds kind of brutal.
Yeah, it does sound pretty harsh, right? But here's the thing. The shocks weren't actually real. The person receiving the shocks was an actor who was just pretending to be in pain.
Oh, wow. So it was all a setup. But the participants didn't know that.
Nope. They were completely in the dark. They believed they were actually inflicting pain on another human being.
That's crazy. So what happened? Did people refuse to administer the shocks?
Well, that's the really disturbing part. The majority of the participants continued to administer the shocks even when the actor was screaming in agony, pleading for them to stop. They just kept going because a figure of authority, the experimenter in the lab coat, told them to.
That's so messed up. It's hard to believe that people would actually do that. But what does this have to do with leadership?
Well, Sinek argues that the Milgram experiment shows how easy it is for us to detach from the human consequences of our actions when there's a layer of abstraction involved.
So in the experiment, the abstraction was the fact that the participants couldn't see the person they were shocking. They were just following orders, focusing on the task at hand.
Exactly. And Sinek says that this kind of abstraction happens in the workplace all the time. We get so focused on hitting targets, meeting deadlines, and climbing the corporate ladder that we lose sight of the real people who are affected by our decisions.
It's like we're operating on autopilot, just going through the motions without really thinking about the impact of our actions.
Exactly. And that can lead to some pretty unethical and even harmful behavior.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we stay connected to our humanity, even in a fast-paced, results-driven work environment?
Well, Sinek argues that it all comes back to leadership. Leaders have a responsibility to create a culture where people feel safe to speak up, to challenge the status quo, and to prioritize human values over blind obedience.
It's about creating that circle of safety we were talking about earlier, where people feel valued and respected, not just as cogs in a machine, but as human beings.
Absolutely. It's about fostering a sense of empathy and shared responsibility where everyone understands the impact of their actions on others.
So it's not just about avoiding unethical behavior. It's about actively promoting a culture of compassion and human connection.
Exactly. And that's where those chemicals of cooperation we were discussing earlier come back into play. Remember how we talked about oxytocin, the hormone that promotes trust and bonding?
Yeah. It's like the glue that holds relationships together.
Right. And when leaders create a culture where people feel safe and connected, it actually triggers the release of oxytocin, which strengthens those bonds and makes people more likely to cooperate and support each other.
So it's not just about being nice or touchy-feely. It's about creating a work environment that's actually aligned with our biology, with how our brains are wired.
Exactly. And that's why Sinek's message is so powerful. It's not just a feel-good philosophy. It's based on a deep understanding of human nature and what makes us tick.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of abstraction and the importance of creating a circle of safety. But what are some concrete steps that leaders can take to actually put these ideas into practice?
Well, Sinek offers a ton of great advice and examples in his book, but one of the key themes that emerges is the idea of leading with humility.
Humility. That's an interesting concept. What does it mean to lead with humility?
It means recognizing that you don't have all the answers, being willing to listen to others and being open to feedback.
About being a servant leader, right?
Right.
Putting the needs of your people before your own ego or ambition.
Exactly. And Sinek gives a really powerful example of this kind of leadership in action with the story of Captain David Marquet.
Oh, yeah. The submarine captain who turned around the worst performing submarine in the fleet. That's a story that really stuck with me.
Me too. It's such a great illustration of how a humble leadership style can create incredible results.
So for those who haven't heard this story, can you give us a quick recap? What did Captain Marquet do differently?
Sure. So when Marquet took command of the Santa Fe, he realized that the traditional command and control leadership style wasn't working. The crew was demoralized, and the submarine was constantly at the bottom of the rankings.
Sounds like a tough situation to walk into. So how did he turn things around?
Well, instead of barking orders and micromanaging every detail, he decided to empower his crew. He gave them more autonomy, encouraged them to think for themselves, and created an environment where they felt safe to speak up and share their ideas.
So it was a complete shift in mindset, right? From I'm the boss and you do what I say to we're all in this together, let's figure this out as a team.
Exactly. And the results were astounding. Under Marquez's leadership, the Santa Fe went from worst to first in the fleet.
That's incredible. It really shows that giving people ownership and trust can unleash their potential.
Right. And it all started with a leader who was willing to step back, listen, and empower his people.
So how can we apply these lessons to our own lives, even if we're not submarine captains?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that humility is not a weakness. It's actually a strength. It allows us to build stronger relationships, foster trust, and create a more collaborative and supportive environment.
And that applies to all kinds of relationships, right?
Yeah.
Not just in the workplace.
Absolutely. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a coach, or a friend, leading with humility can make a huge difference.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be themselves, to learn, and to grow.
Exactly. And you know what? It's actually good for us too. Leading with humility can help us to be more open-minded, more compassionate, and ultimately more fulfilled in our own lives. So leading with humility, it's not just about being nice. It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers, being open to learning from others.
And being willing to admit when we're wrong, right? Not letting our ego get in the way.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where everyone feels comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas, even if they're different from ours.
It takes courage to do that. Especially in a work environment where there's often a lot of pressure to conform.
You're telling me. But Sinek argues that when we can create that kind of environment, that's where the real magic happens. That's where innovation and creativity can truly flourish.
Because when people feel safe to take risks, to experiment, that's when they come up with those groundbreaking ideas.
Right. They're not afraid to fail because they know they won't be punished for it. They know that their team has their back, and that they can learn and grow from their mistakes.
It's like that whole fail fast, fail often philosophy. But it only works if there's a culture of trust and psychological safety in place.
Absolutely. And that's where leadership comes in. Leaders have the power to create that kind of environment, or they can destroy it.
It's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
But it also makes you realize how powerful leadership can be, right? When done well, it can literally transform a team, a company, even an entire society.
I totally agree. And Sinek gives some amazing examples of leaders who have done just that. People who have inspired others to achieve extraordinary things by simply creating a space where they felt safe, valued, and empowered.
Like Captain Marquet, right?
Yeah.
The submarine captain. His story is just mind-blowing.
Right.
He took command of the worst-performing submarine in the fleet and turned it into the best.
It's such a great example of what can happen when a leader embraces humility and empowers their team. Instead of micromanaging every detail, Marquet gave his crew autonomy, encouraged them to think for themselves, and the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, the Santa Fe went from worst to first under his leadership.
Yeah.
It's proof that you don't have to be a dictator to be an effective leader. In fact, sometimes the most effective leaders are the ones who step back and let their team shine.
Exactly. And you know what's really cool? Sinek actually points out that this kind of leadership style isn't just good for the team, it's good for the leader, too.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. When you're constantly stressed out, micromanaging everything, trying to control every outcome, it takes a toll on you, right? It burns you out.
Oh, absolutely. Been there, done that. Not fun.
But when you trust your team, when you empower them to make decisions, it frees you up to focus on the bigger picture. You can actually enjoy your work more, and you're less likely to get burned out.
So it's a win-win situation. The team thrives and the leader thrives. Everyone's happy.
Exactly. And that's what Sinek is all about. creating a world where work isn't just about grinding away and making money. It's about finding meaning, purpose, and connection.
And feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself, making a real difference in the world.
Exactly. And that's what I love about Sinek's work. He doesn't just talk about the problems, he offers solutions. He gives us a roadmap for creating a better future, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
Yeah, he's a real optimist, isn't he? But it's an optimism that's grounded in reality. He's not just saying everything's going to be fine. He's saying, here's how we can make things better. And that's a message I can get behind.
Me too. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Leaders Eat Last, what's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
That's a good question. I guess if I had to pick just one thing, it would be this. Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's not about having all the answers. It's about creating a space where everyone feels safe, valued, and empowered to contribute their best.
Beautifully said. And that's something we can all strive for, whether we're in a formal leadership position or not. We can all be leaders in our own way simply by creating those circles of safety in our own lives.
Absolutely. So if you're inspired to learn more, you can find a link to the full book in the description or pinned comment. We highly recommend checking it out.
And in the meantime, keep asking questions, keep challenging the status quo, and keep leading with heart.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep making the world a better place.